China's China.
How Africa is becoming China's China.
This video was made possible by Brilliant. Start learning with Brilliant for 20% off by being one of the first 200 to sign up at
Starts a little slow, but
brilliant.org/Wendover.
okay. Bear with me.
Political
First
alliances manifest themselves here, on the voting floor of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, New York. In this room, countries impose legislation that carries weight worldwide, and so what happens in this room is the physical materialization of the world's politics. 47 years ago, exactly that happened when one of the General Assembly's most consequential votes occurred. China, you see, essentially has two governments. There's the Republic of China, which used to control the mainland and Taiwan, but today only administers Taiwan, and there's the People's Republic of China, which controls the mainland. Both claim to be the rightful governments of all of the Chinese territory, both Taiwan and the mainland, and so back in 1971, the United Nations had to decide which government would represent China. Essentially, the question was which government was the rightful leader of the territory, as there could only be one in the United Nations. The US was the main superpower opposing the People's Republic representing China, as it had a strong political and military alliance with the Republic of China government, and so the vote was essentially the US's sphere of influence versus the world. Among the 35 countries that voted against the People's Republic were much of Africa, the Central African Republic, Chad, Gabon, Liberia, Niger, South Africa, and plenty of others that sided with the US. Despite the US's effort, the resolution ended up passing, and the representative government for China in the UN was switched to the People's Republic of China. But what's interesting about this vote is not the result, it's who voted against the People's Republic. Since that 1971 vote, you see, something has changed. In 2007, the UN General Assembly met once again to vote on whether to adopt a resolution condemning the human rights situation in North Korea. As one of North Korea's strongest allies, this vote was China and its sphere of influence versus the world. In this vote, though, only Burundi, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritania, and Tanzania voted against China. All the 43 other African countries either abstained or voted no along with China, because in the 40 years between these votes, political ties changed. Africa no longer bows to the US. Much of the continent is now economically and politically aligned with the world's fastest emerging superpower, China. The simple answer for why this is because China has pumped huge amounts of money into the continent of Africa. They're buying allies. For example, China built a $3.2 billion railway in Kenya trekking the 300 miles from Nairobi, the capital, to Mombasa, the second largest city and primary port, in 4 hours and 30 minutes. That's faster than what the fastest train in the US, the Acela Express, takes to travel the equivalent distance from Philadelphia to Boston. China also built a $526 million dam in Guinea, which helped push the country from having constant power shortages to making more energy than it needs and selling the extra capacity to its neighbors. China also built a $475 million light rail system in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa, designed as a way to combat the capital's crippling traffic. These are only a sampling. There are literally hundreds of others of Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa each year. All across the continent, China is playing a part in projects both big and small that are transforming African economies. It's important to note that these projects are not, though, free. Each of these three were financed by loans granted by China's state-owned and controlled Export-Import Bank, and these loans do, of course, need to be paid back by the countries granted them. Large African infrastructure projects, though, would be viewed as risky by any traditional bank and would therefore struggle to get financed, but China's Export-Import Bank doesn't care. Assuming cooperation between the Chinese and African countries' governments, this bank will give low-interest or no-interest loans to African countries so they can build these trains or dams or other projects. These loans are therefore considered a form of foreign aid since China doesn't expect to get all their money back, at least adjusted for inflation, since they're not charging much interest and there's a high risk of default. Of course, China isn't just financing these projects out of kindness. For each of them, there's a political goal behind it. You see, the country of China is running out of growth potential. Its era of double-digit year-over-year GDP growth is over as it makes the shift from industrializing to industrialized. Africa, meanwhile, is one of the least developed areas of the world, and a lack of development actually makes fast growth easy. The first step of economic development for many countries is natural resource exploitation. Nearly every country has some level of natural resources that can be used to kickstart growth, but first they need to have enough money to build the infrastructure and take the steps needed to gather these natural resources. As everyone knows, it takes money to make money, and China has money. By investing in African mining and farming, China can profit off Africa's growth and fuel the business back in China that requires minerals and food. But in addition to serving as a source of natural resources, Africa has another resource: labor. It might seem strange that China, the country that the world uses for low-cost manufacturing, is looking for a labor source elsewhere, but that is exactly what it's doing. China is a victim of its own success. The economic development that its manufacturing industry brought pushed a large segment of its population into the middle class, which raised labor costs countrywide. It's not bad news. China as a country has shifted from having a low-skilled to a medium-skilled workforce as their education level has improved, but for the lowest cost, lowest skilled manufacturing work, the country of China is no longer competitive. Therefore, Chinese manufacturing firms are setting up their own operations in Africa, one of the cheapest and lowest skilled labor markets in the world. Today, China is now the largest trading partner with Africa as a whole. Despite China being a vastly larger country than the US in population, the US and China both trade a similar value of goods worldwide each year. In this case, though, whereas $48 billion worth of goods were exchanged between the US and Africa in 2016, China traded $128 billion worth of goods, nearly 3 times as much. Now, the whole idea of setting up a structure of power over other less developed states in order to gather resources. In this case, though, whereas 4 lowest skilled labor markets in the world. Today, China is now the largest trading partner with Africa as a whole. Despite China being a vastly larger country than the US in population, the US and China both trade a similar value of goods worldwide each year. In this case,
Their export-import volume put together, global trade, the same amount. See, it's the same amount.
Yeah, but I don't believe it.
You don't believe it?
No.
Why not?
US 10 times
What?
trade. Same trade?
Of course, the composition is different because US has a trade deficit, whereas China has a trade surplus. Actually, does China still have a trade surplus? Yeah, I think they do.
China export to US a lot of money. America.
Not with
Yes,
each other, global entirely.
Yeah, I know. But the US export import $3.88 trillion. Same amount. Okay. I can't think that.
You want to wiki it?
No, I don't know. Okay, go ahead.
Whereas $48 billion worth of goods were exchanged between the US and Africa in 2016, China traded $128 billion worth of goods, nearly 3 times as much. Now, the whole idea of setting up a structure of power over other less developed states in order to gather resources and use their labor force might sound familiar, because that's largely what colonialism was. The motives behind European powers expanding their territory to less developed nations in the 15th through 20th centuries were remarkably similar to the motivations between China's growing economic influence in the developing world today. Despite what some may say, there is empirical evidence that China has been using these infrastructure investments to affect worldwide politics. It's been found that if an African country recognizes Taiwan as a country, they receive, on average, 2.7 fewer Chinese infrastructure projects within their borders each year. Conversely, if
20.7 fewer Chinese infrastructure.
So if you vote against China, you are almost 3 times less likely to receive financing from China.
What does it mean, 2.7?
So countries who are voting with China are much more likely to get China's financing.
Lots of materials here. I don't. Okay. I don't understand. What, the 2.7 fewer?
So 2.7 times fewer chance of getting financing from China. So if African countries vote with Vietnam or not Vietnam, with Taiwan, if they are not aligned with China politically, then they are much less likely to receive financing for the infrastructural projects. But these numbers are a little bit skewed because I don't think it takes into account who was already receiving money. So it's not like you will be punished, but it's logically, if there is an economic relationship between two countries, they're more likely to support each other because there is an interest. I mean, you see that everywhere. We have the European Song Contest, and obviously countries who are friendly with each other politically, they're much more easy to vote for their representative during the contest. So that's logical. Basically, what they are saying, their argument is that by investing in these countries, they are actually expanding their influence within the UN. One country, one vote, no? One country, one vote, and Africa has a lot of countries. 54, I believe. 54?
Yeah, 54, 5, yes.
So 54 countries, and China is investing in a lot of them. They are investing much more in Africa than the US is, almost 3 times as much as the US is. They have more risks, but they get political influence. Plus, they get economic influence. They can tap into the natural resources and the potential of labor. And infrastructure will help them to capture the value that they will generate in the future in Africa, and get that product out of Africa into China.
What does it mean fewer? Compared with what?
Fewer investments.
China has fewer investment?
If you vote against China, it's much less likely that you will get funding or investment from China, which is logical, of course. If you're against me in the UN, if you vote against me against my interests, then there will be less tendency for China to support your economy or economic development or invest in your country. You see that very easily. I mean, China is also, for example, tourism. There are a lot of Chinese, and when they go overseas, and they spend a lot of money. So what happened is, I don't know, where was it? Korea? I think Korea was creating a conflict, and then the Chinese discouraged their citizens to go to Korea. And at the same time, there was some kind of like a new relationship with Taiwan, so they promoted, not Taiwan, of course not Taiwan, Thailand. And now the overwhelming majority of Chinese tourists are going to Thailand. So people are following very closely what the state wants.
Why Chinese infrastructure policy get fewer?
In countries that do not vote with them in the UN.
Okay.
That's the point.
Okay.
African country votes overwhelmingly along with China in the United Nations General Assembly, they receive 1.8 more infrastructure projects each year. Considering that the General Assembly is an equal representative body where each country gets one vote no matter if they have 1 million residents or 1 billion, China is getting a lot of influence for, in the grand scheme of things, not a lot of money. China touts the fact that their foreign investment and aid is no strings attached. Unlike other institutions that give low or no interest loans to developing countries like the International Monetary Fund or World Bank, China gives loans with no requirements on factors like respect of human rights or democratic elections. Of course, this data linking infrastructure investment with political leanings shows that there are indeed hidden strings that require benefit for China rather than benefit for the receiving country. Western powers are understandably concerned about this shift in power dynamics towards a country with vastly different ideals. In 2017, China entered a select club as it opened a military base in Djibouti. While 4 other countries have bases in Djibouti, France, Italy, Japan, and the US, this base was unique as it was China's first base abroad, and those by themselves, military bases abroad, are unique. Only 15 of the world's most developed and militarily powerful countries worldwide have them, and now China is one of them. Although Western powers might be worried for the wrong reasons. The government of China is clearly putting a lot of focus and money into Africa, but not as much as you'd think based off the result they're getting: vast amounts of influence over a whole continent. There are 2 key numbers to look at. In 2015, China loaned just $12 billion to African countries. In the same year, the country invested a mere $3 billion into the continent. That's just not much, but the reason China is gaining this enormous influence over the continent is because the Chinese government no longer has to force this phenomenon. Private Chinese industry is taking hold of Africa. Of the estimated 10,000 Chinese businesses in Africa, 90% of them are privately owned rather than one of the numerous Chinese state-run companies. The Chinese companies in Africa are actually making money, some substantially so. The Chinese government certainly has provided a considerable push to the industrialization of Africa, but now that that's done, economic forces are pushing the initiative further forward. Chinese small business is gripping the continent. Much of the Western world is ignoring the prospects of the continent, ignoring that business in Africa can now be as profitable as business in China was when its period of tremendous growth began. Right now, Africa is establishing itself as the source of labor and resources for China, and so, until the West pays attention, Africa will continue inching forward on its path towards becoming China's China. One of the techniques used to predict the GDP or GDP growth of a country, which is of course used to decide which country to invest in, is machine learning. For example, here's what a machine learning model predicted a country's GDP would be over 3 months, and here's what it actually was. It forecasted the country's GDP far better than humans did. The science behind predictions like this is complex, but fascinating. If you want to learn how it works, though, the best place to do so is brilliant.org. Their machine learning course makes this advanced concept.
Sorry. This is they're now upselling. So go to the other video.
Go to other video.
Yeah. So it's not relevant. So the point here is basically what China has been doing is they are investing in Africa, no strings attached. Different from the West, who also have they attach moral strings to their investment. They're saying, okay, you're not very credible, but we're nonetheless we are prepared to give you a loan at very reduced rates as long as you do not commit any crimes against humanity and whatever. But China doesn't do that. There are no moral strings attached. Basically, they respect whatever you are doing in that country, and that's fine. But it's implied that you vote with China in the UN. What you also see, what's very important, is that actually the initial push into Africa created an infrastructure that allows private interests into China. And now they are actually doing that on a large scale. So the initial push by the Chinese government is now followed by a private push into Africa. So they created the infrastructure that will help companies like Huawei and others into developing their business interest into Africa, which is could be very well. It probably is very valuable in the future. First as business process outsourcing, but then if we can expect a middle class to emerge from Africa, which will be able to purchase goods, and that will create more opportunities for China to do business and use it as a consumer market. So China has been very strategically and also understandably been pushing into China, into Africa, probably because they understood, like nobody else, based on their most recent experience, that they came from a situation that was, well, more or less comparable to what China is going through now, and they have moved in smartly, whereas European and Americans have basically missed out, and Japanese as well.
Why the China is trying to make lots of money invest into Africa?
Well, what they're saying is that on a grander scheme of things, it's not that much. So they didn't invest that huge amount of money. Still, it's 2.5 times more. But what China did is that actually they saw that there are a number of interest there. The interest is political, so they can extend their sphere of influence by investing into those countries. Then there is the need for natural resources in China that could be fed from Africa, so that's another interest. Then there is the infrastructure into China and tapping into the future where Africa will become more and more important because they have a growing population, they have an uneducated population. So what China has been doing in the past 2-3 decades, that's something, that a role that's going to be replaced by Africa, and China can tap into that because they already have the infrastructure into Africa, where the West has been ignoring it, where the West has been imposing all kinds of moral restrictions upon loans and of help, and trying to still have this colonial paternalistic attitudes towards African countries. China has been more pragmatic and saying, okay, so if you need the money, then okay, you have an interest, we also have an interest, but that was on basically on equal footing. So they were not like talking down to Africa. They basically say, okay, so the way you do business is the way you do business, but if you want to develop your country, we are there to support you.